Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining an important discussion. This session is part of the Skoll World Forum's Ecosystem Day and is wholly curated and hosted by Search for Common Ground. My name is Fatima Madaki. I'm the National Program Manager with Search in Nigeria. Peace and democracy are closely intertwined, and the challenges facing the world's democracies, conflict, human rights abuse, polarization, corruption, contested elections, rising authoritarianism, military coups, makes this relationship more relevant and crucial than ever. From Ukraine to North Africa to South Asia and to Nigeria, we're seeing democracy backsliding. And it's undermining the progress for representative governance. In 2001, we also marked a year of opportunity for democracies. The United States hosted the first ever democracy summit for over 100 governments around the world, kicking off a year of global efforts designed to strengthen democratic norms. Today, I'm joined by USAID Deputy Assistant Administrator Johnny Walsh, who will engage in an in-depth conversation with a panel of distinguished civil society practitioners working on democracy, peace, and governance issues all over the world. And also would be discussing on the future of democracies and how international stakeholders can better come together to address the cause. USAID Deputy Assistant Administrator Johnny Walsh oversees the Bureau for Development, Democracy and Innovation Center for Democracy, Human Rights and Governance. He was most recently a senior expert at the United States Institute of Peace from 2017 to 2021, and has previously served in government in a range of foreign policy roles, including the US mission to the United Nations Senior Policy Advisor for the Middle East and South Asia. Two stints as the State Department's lead advisor on Afghanistan's peace processes and tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. He has extensive additional policy experience on Pakistan, the Arabian Peninsula, North Africa, and Yemen. We will hear from him what USAID's vision is concerning strengthening democracies, and then would move on to have a discussion with the three civil society activists from Ukraine, Tunisia, and Kenya, who I'll be introducing to you in a short while. But before we get there, I'd like to hand over to Johnny Walsh. Thank you so much for joining us for this session. I would like to hand over to you for your keynote address.
Thank you, Fatima. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you to Skoll and to Search for Common Ground. I kind of can't believe I'm alongside this particular group of panelists, all of whom should probably be the keynotes instead of me, but they're truly world changers, and there's so much that I think we're going to learn from them. The state of democracy generally, I think this group probably all knows the very dreary statistic that there have been 16 consecutive years with less freedom in the world as opposed to more. There are many reasons for that. I think I'm going to resist the temptation to offer the perfect encapsulation or description of the problem, partly because others on this discussion can do it better. But more importantly, I'd like to use my short time to focus on the actionable, like what can USAID do, what can we all do? And I would really stress that I've never seen a clearer case in my career where a crisis of democracy was also an opportunity. And I think that was true even before the war in Ukraine came along and focused all of our minds so intensely on the crisis of democracy. But I say it because the very same factors that have caused so much harm in so many countries and drifted so many places towards authoritarianism, they are the very things that are scaring the democratic actors around the world and rallying them to action. Perhaps it's not always as much action or as aggressive as it needs to be, but what maybe once was a nice to have, parts of, say, the US government system to support democracy, to advance human rights, now feel like true national security priorities in a way that I'm not sure they ever have before. And that's why you have a president who, every time he opens his mouth about foreign policy, democracy is one of the first words that comes out, and defining the great challenge of our time as this struggle between growing authoritarianism and the democracy that binds our societies together. And then the war in Ukraine comes along and just turbocharges that trend, I think. And we are so much more focused on it than we were before. So what is USAID doing? First of all, we have a mountain of existing work everywhere in the world. Through USAID missions that are all over the world, we are supporting activists and civil society. We are supporting journalists and independent media outlets. We are monitoring elections and helping prepare for them. We are advancing the rule of law and human rights. We're working with labor groups for worker rights. We're working with oppressed groups across a range of fronts. Every demographically disadvantaged group we are trying to empower. We're doing anti-corruption work. We're trying to advance good governance. That's all steady state for USAID. I think it's been impactful, that the quiet work that we do all the time. And I genuinely believe the democratic backsliding phenomenon would be all the worse if it weren't for USAID and many others doing that kind of work. But to meet this particular moment, I would highlight three things that we're especially focused on to try and push back on the backsliding phenomenon and reinvigorate democracy everywhere. First is to identify where democracy is breaking out organically and to place big bets in those places. So, for example, for all the countries we hear about that are backsliding, every single year there's at least one, there's often many remarkable democratic openings that happen around the world, and they get no attention. Sometimes they get attention. Maidan Square did, the Arab Spring did, but a great many of them go pretty unnoticed compared to the crisis spots in the world. And the tragedy of that is that all too often a country experiences an opening, makes a certain amount of progress, nobody comes in to help in constructive ways. And then before long, for one reason or another, there's backsliding again. And I don't think I have to name the countries. I'd be happy to name the countries, but I think it goes without saying where this has happened. So one of our marquee initiatives is called the Partnerships for Democracy, where we are trying to identify places where this is underway and to surge assistance quickly, but also over the medium and long term, so that the actors who have driven democracy in these places can actually show results, and they don't experience backsliding or just lose the next election to some new conglomeration of kleptocrats or oligarchs or whoever the villain was beforehand. That's one category. I'd say another category where democracy breaks out organically and we can do more to help are places that look very autocratic on the surface, but where the autocrat in question has lost the crowd, and where the overwhelming majority of society has risen up against whatever the heinous force is. So where am I talking about? I mean, I'm talking about Belarus is a clear example. Sudan is a clear example. Myanmar is a clear example. Hong Kong, I would say Venezuela. And so USAID or all of the donors in the world are not going to ultimately make the difference between success or failure of those democratic movements. But I think there is much more we can do to support nonviolent mass action, to give those movements that are fighting for everything we believe in and trying to create a much better society than they currently suffer under, to give them the greatest chance of success they can possibly have. So that's category one I would identify. Second category is we need to rally that enthusiasm for democracy that we see in some of the places I just named everywhere. And that is the core idea of the Summit for Democracy under the Biden administration. I mean, summits are just events. They can only do so much good on their own. As an internal matter, they certainly did a lot of good in shaking loose major commitments of resources and policies to advance democracy within our system. I can personally attest. I think they did that to all of the other systems of countries that participated, where everyone had to come with a package of commitments for what they would do, both to strengthen their own democracies and to help the larger cause around the world. Most countries took that quite seriously. Many made amazing packages of commitments, which are all available online. But the event itself was meant to just identify the problem and rally enthusiasm for solutions. How we can support some of the democratic actors in hard places, how we can support each other, and kind of make democracy the glue that binds these allies and partners together. And the Year of Action, the possibly too cute name that we've given for the period in between the first summit, which happened in December, and the second one, which will happen either late this year or early next year, we intend to get quite a lot done on a range of fronts, from tech and democracy to anti-corruption to supporting labor, to many of the lines of effort that I described before. And we expect to have a good story to tell at the second summit. I would say, for the benefit of this crowd, I think that the democratic partners and allies I'm describing are not at all just governments, and they're not at all just mass movements out in the street. We need a lot more involvement from the private sector and from foundations, where we're working together, we're deconflicting our efforts. I would love to be highlighting them much more at the second summit and the great work that we've done. So this is not a exchange of business cards situation, but if any of this is resonating, like, we would love to have much greater involvement from groups like yours at the second summit. And the third bucket I will identify as, at least speaking for USAID, we were overdue to update how we support democracy, how our programming supports it. Which is not to say that any of what I uncharitably refer to as the steady state activities were outdated. They're all still crucial. I can find very little that we designed in the 90s when this kind of art form or community of practice of democracy support formed. But much of it needed an update. There were the things that we were just doing too little of relative to the problem in the world. And I would say anti-corruption is one example. We've radically expanded our anti-corruption efforts with a highly empowered task force within USAID. The entire space of digital democracy versus digital authoritarianism is a quintessential example. I hardly need to enumerate the different ways in which authoritarians have managed to weaponize digital tools, use them to propagate disinformation, et cetera, et cetera. At USAID and at the State Department, elsewhere in US government, we are trying to dramatically expand our efforts to promulgate technology that entrenches democratic and human rights values rather than serving as the greatest threat to them. And third, in a crisis-rich world, we need to significantly expand our rapid response capability. USAID already has quite a bit of it to respond to either some of these democratic openings or authoritarian crackdowns. But we have embedded it significantly into the major funds that we control. Pots of money that we control. And you can see the effect of that. For example, when Ukraine has broken out, we've already been able to use these mechanisms to surge support to actors on the ground, to help monitor abuses, get journalists and activists to safety, to prepare for civic resistance in parallel to the armed struggle, if that's where this all goes, to expose and disseminate the truth of the war, to help ensure Ukraine has continuity of government under any of the contingencies that could happen. So I think that rapid response capability has been very useful to us. And I'll close out because I want to hear from others. I would say I've talked a lot about our programming as one tool for how the US supports democracy. I am keenly aware that the good or harm that the US does for democracy in the world goes far beyond the particulars of our programming. And it has to do with some major factors that are not entirely within USAID's control, including the quality of American democracy at home and how sincerely we factor democracy and human rights into our other foreign policy decisions. Every time there's some tough call about who to sell weapons to or whatever. I understand those are both giant topics. We can go into them in discussion if anyone wants to poke at those. I definitely have views on both. But most importantly, we are keenly aware of how impactful those can be on the behavior of both authoritarians and of democratic actors around the world. So I think this is an all hands on deck moment, especially with the war in Ukraine, swallowing up so much attention, but also rallying people. And really, this had to be an all hands on deck moment long before Russia crossed those borders. But I think the difference over the last 6 weeks is that now we look around and we see democratic allies united in this effort, and most of the world united in complete revulsion at what Russia is doing. And in tandem, this widespread sense that the heroism Ukraine is showing in fighting for democracy is not so different from the heroism we see from other democratic movements around the world, and that maybe this is worth fighting for. So shame on all of us if we can't rise to the moment and channel this energy into something useful. So thank you for hearing me out. I'm eager to hear the rest of my fellow panelists.
Thank you so much, Johnny, for your keynote presentation, and the major highlights that I was able to pick is the support that you said is rendering to backsliding democracies, and rallying enthusiasm for democracies across the world, to end commitments to strengthen democracy, and updating how democracy is supported in terms of digital tools and technology and rapid response. We're going to move on now to hear from our speakers. It is important to understand the implications of what you've just shared in non-Western democracies, especially those that are confronted with rising conflict, governance, and human rights challenges. Before we move on to hear from our speakers, I'd like to say if our audience have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A box and we would respond. What remarks are. I would also like to invite everyone to think a bit more about challenges. I'm going to introduce our first speaker now. His name is Roman Polyshock. He's the youth and peace activist in Lviv, Ukraine. He's been advocating in Ukraine for values through forums such as the Partnership for Change Conference and the Nobel Peace Prize Forum. More recently, he's been helping Ukrainian companies find clients around the world and started his own consulting business as well in practice. He continued his advocacy work in the meantime, and since February 2022, Roman has spoken with journalists and briefed international civil society across civil society actors on the situation on ground in Ukraine. He's also leading grassroots support networks of his community. Roman, you're in a good position to ability for peace to return back to democratic norms.
Thank you, Fatima, but could you please repeat the question because you were cut off in a moment and I didn't hear it.
Okay, the question is, can you tell us what
Could you please do it one more time? I would really appreciate it because you were cut off again.
Okay, I'd like you to share what the state of democracy is in Ukraine and what the possibility is for peace to return.
Now that's good. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Fatima, and thank you for such a great introduction. I think never in my life I was introduced so well, so thank you very much for that. It is a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity to speak on this wonderful platform today. I want to, of course, thank Search for Common Ground and the rest of the organizers for making it happen and for inviting me and giving us all an opportunity to speak about the things that really matter. Separately, I want to thank Johnny for the great points that he has just made. I absolutely agree with every single point, and it touches on some of the things that I want to talk about today. To touch on the question of the challenges and opportunities for democracy in Ukraine, I would probably want to start with a brief journey through the history of Ukraine, because a lot of people are not really familiar with it. I will not be diving too deep since Ukraine indeed has a long history. I will just mention the Cossacks and the constitution of Polyshock, that was written in 1710 and established the principles of separation of powers and limited the executive authority of the hetman, or the leader of Cossacks at that time. And they created their own parliament called General Council. Since then, and actually well before that, Ukrainians were always considered free people who were supporting and fighting for democratic values like freedom of assembly, association and speech, inclusiveness and equality. For example, Ukraine is one of the founding countries of the United Nations and was always one of the first to sign all of the international agreements, support our partners around the world, and even send peacekeeping contingent that was recently returned back to Ukraine. Besides that, I want to look at state of the democratic reforms in Ukraine, and this is something that Johnny has already mentioned, but in the recent years, for example, creation of one of the best government procurement systems in the world called Prozoro that already saved billions of dollars and opened the government contracts to businesses around Ukraine. Reform of the police, creation of anti-corruption bodies, you name it. If you have been to Ukraine before in the recent years, you have seen that Ukraine is indeed a democratic country where we do have free speech, where we do have inclusiveness. And for that, you don't have to really go far and look into the leaders of different religions peacefully coexisting in Kiev and doing the work together. Where if people to decide to vote for the comic to become a president, they do it and he becomes one. And he becomes the president that leads us through this war. But you should also understand that Ukrainians are always ready to change their leader if the current one would not do as they wish. And this is one of the reasons that the war broke out back in 2014. Everything became obvious, and it happened because of the young people like myself who came up on the streets to defend our rights for European, you can read it as democratic future. And later on, it turned into the revolution of dignity back in 2014. And then it sparked the invasion of Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk regions. And also, you can ask why that happened. Because Putin could not put up with the idea that Ukraine can be independent and democratic country. And now in 2022, we have the same situation, but at the bigger scale. So what I'm trying to communicate to you today is that Ukraine was for a long time, is, and will stay a democratic country. We know what we are fighting for. It is worth fighting for. And thank you, all international partners, for being with us, for fighting with us, and for helping us preserve democracy and its values, not only for Ukraine, but for the world. So thank you very much. That is my answer. Thank you. Fatima, this is it on my end. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Roman. Now we move to Tunisia, where we would hear from Moez Ali. He's a civil society activist focused on human rights, focused on working on human rights, civic education, and countering violent extremism. Moez, following the Arab Spring of 2011, Tunisia was held up as a beacon of hope for democracy amid the turmoil and the uprisings across the Middle East and North Africa, but has recently experienced a backsliding as well of the democratic norms. Talk to us about what you see as the challenges of democracy in Tunisia and where the opportunities for building norms and institutions in the spirit of civil resistance are. Especially following the resistance that led Tunisians to the streets over 10 years ago.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I would like to thank organizers and Serge for coming around for hosting this panel. When I read the topic and when I was considering what is happening in Tunisia now and since 2011, I said, just to answer this question, I will speak for hours. Anyway, so I will try to make it as short as possible. Definitely, democracy in Tunisia is facing a lot of challenges. I need to start with the uprising, because when we had the uprising in 2011, which was a a social movement. It was not led by political parties. It was really people who were on the street just claiming for three things: freedom, dignity, and work. And then we started the democratic transition. Unfortunately, if I evaluate all what happened since then in Tunisia, I would say that it was more working on taking over the control of the former authoritarian regime of Ben Ali, more than implementing the real mechanism and tools of democracy. This is unfortunately the result, my personal opinion, and the result of the last decades of what was mirrored to the international community as democracy, but what we call as a democracy, but with non-democratic practices. When I see that when we have been monitoring us as civil society actors, what was happening under the dome of the parliament with such high violent speech, othering speech, a speech that can break the social cohesion of the society that was unified before in fighting Ben Ali and fighting the regime of Ben Ali. Unfortunately, we noticed that there was a break in the social cohesion, and we noticed that there was for sure a lot of security issues with the appearance of the radical groups. We did not have real time in putting on place the real mechanism of democracy. So certainly we spent 3 years to have the new constitution that is filled with that, where we have a lot of gaps, and we have unfortunately we did not complete the process of putting in place the constitutional institution and the constitutional court. So we did not achieve the mechanism. However, we noticed that the practices of democracy were not well perceived, and the population start losing trust year after year from let's say what they mirrored as a democracy by the new rulers post revolution. Johnny said that the Arab Spring, yes, Tunisia is one of the initiator of the Arab Spring, but unfortunately at this period of this time, I cannot call it spring because unfortunately, and this is my personal opinion as civil society actors, we are in a crossroad where we don't want to go back. You know that what happened in July 25th of last year, where there was the freeze of the parliament and the actual President Said taking over the control of all the executive power. Unfortunately, we are in the position where we don't want to go back in the pre-25th of July because of all the negative impact that had on the society with the othering mentality, that means splitting the sharing, breaking the cohesion, splitting the population between us and them. Also the social economic situation that is getting worse and worse, over 100,000 school dropout a year, with the appearance of the radical groups, and you are all aware about all the recruitment of Tunisian youth and sending them to the zone of conflicts, the rise of radicalization and the rise of violence. So there is all the most important thing. One of the reasons why we had the revolution is to enable youth to have youngsters to have access to job. And now we have the increase of unemployment reaching up to 20% of the Tunisian society. So this is what happened pre-25, post-25. Now we have a person who have all the power in his hand, the judicial, the legislative power are in one hand. So how we can build a democracy, having one person taking all the decision, building the future of the nation only based on his own vision, if he have a vision, taking into consideration the economic situation of Tunisia, and also that he is basing all his communication through social media and with a populist approach. And this is one of the major things that we have in Tunisia, is that now we consider that the democracy was in threat before 25, and it is more now because we don't have a participative approach. The president actually, I think he have a problem in dealing with intermediary actors such as civil society or political parties. So I think he would like to have a direct communication with the population, erasing all the intermediary actors from his way. And this is, for me, it's a high risk to democracy. And also we are now getting into getting ready to next election of the next parliamentary election that unfortunately, I don't know how it's being prepared, since there is no participative approach. Us as civil society actors, as we faced any kind of play that was made by the extremists or by the Islamists before the 25th of July, now we will be back on the street. We will be back as and try to create an opposition in order to reinstate the democracy and to reinstate the practices of democracy. Now, as civil society actors, we don't even know what's happening in our country, how it is ruled, how the decisions are taken, and all the decisions are being taken by one person, and that is going to, and we don't know where it's going to lead us. Now, I would like to thank Johnny and his organization. But just by the way, I'm a former staff of USAID in Tunisia in the early 90s. Yeah, it's thanks to all the international stakeholders such as USAID, Search for Common Ground, who supported the civil society and who made our work possible. Because if you compare the first version of the Constitution and the last version of the Constitution, all the changes and the progress that were inserted in them are the fruit of the opposition of the civil society actors. What we need now, certainly we experienced some good things and bad things in the first experience, in the July 25th period. I think now we need more support towards the civil society organization and NGOs, and particularly on the local area, because now we have another opportunity to build a new and a real democracy. And I think it's your help and assistance is more than welcome, taking into consideration that our actual president, he is not seeing well the work of the civil society organization. And I quote his last declaration that all the civil society organizations that are supported by international organization are the front face of political parties. And this is in a way that he's working on contributing the efforts of the civil society and contributing the trust that the population have on civil society organization. So definitely democracy is at risk. Now we have, unfortunately, also many of the organizations, the highest judicial council was dissolute. The parliament, there is the dissolution of the parliament now. So we have to rebuild all the constitutional institutions. We have to work on rebuilding the administration, and trying to modernize the public administration because of the increase of the rate of corruption. Now we have a formal corrupted state. So this is one, we have an issue of governance. We have an issue of practice of democracy, the weak institutions, a very bad social economic situation. So what democracy we are talking about, or we would like to mirror, or we would like to sell to the Tunisian society when they don't even have, can have access to flour or to the basis need to have a dignity, to have a good life. And when we have over 100,000 kids dropping school, and when we have the increase of radicalization, And however,
given the time we have left.
Yes, I will just finish now.
Okay.
The civil society organization, we are committed to fulfill our responsibility in facing any person who may stop the implementation of a real democracy. And I think the fight is still going on. And we count on your support in supporting the civil society organization and NGOs to finish our fight and reach out to real democracy in Tunisia. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Moez, for your presentation. We have a lot of interesting comments and questions already trickling in. Please keep them coming. However, I'd like to hand over to Judy Kimamo, who is Search for Common Ground's Director of Programming for the Swahili Coast, based in Mombasa, Kenya. Judy has 15 years of experience as a program specialist and has previously been Search's country director in Kenya, where she led programs on healing ethnic divides, transforming violent extremism, and building trust between security forces and civilians. Just like Nigeria, Judy, Kenya has an upcoming election in August 2022. Talk to us about the state of governance and the democracy landscape. What is the state of democracy in Kenya?
Very well. So the country has gone through quite a bit of evolution. We started from a one-party state from 1963, when we had our first government, publicly owned government, up to 1992, when there was a push for multipartyism. And when the push for multipartyism came, there was a bit of resistance, countrywide resistance, and we saw many people put behind bars, many people incarcerated. It was at that same time when the Nobel Peace Laureate, Wangari Maathai, was tear gassed in a public park where she had gone to protest with women against the one-party system that was really very dictatorial. And in 2010, the clamor for democracy was achieved because of a very vibrant civil society, a very vibrant engagement, even within the arms of government. And in 2010, we got our first constitution that guaranteed a Bill of Rights that gave benchmarks and hallmarks of what leadership should be, and gave different levels of accountability, including citizens being able to call the government to account for various actions of various things that the government had committed. So that was the turning point. But of course, the turning point was because we had had a very violent election in 2007, and we had had mediators coming on board. Kofi Annan and a team of eminent persons came to help the country coalesce together and think and talk together. And the two principal leaders agreed to form a coalition government. So what has happened since is that we have seen the two candidates who then came into the new government after a new constitution were candidates that had been taken to ICC because of various crimes against humanity. And they agreed and formed a coalition that became a popular movement. And because they were seen to have forgiven each other and agreed to work together and bringing the communities that had fought each other, they formed a government. They came to 2017, and again, there was quite a competitive process that was almost going to break the country again. But by this time, some of the key institutions like the judiciary had built its muscle in a manner that they were able to relook at the election grievances that were presented, and the election was nullified. So this was the first time an election was nullified and the parties were sent back to to rerun. Of course, because the issues are not addressed, we found that the other aggrieved party did not contest in the rerun. But that just shows that the country had morphed and grown in terms of independence of the judiciary, which previously, like Tunisia, had been usurped by the state, by the executive. However, one thing that still remains that we have carried on from 2017 on is that there's this coalition of violence. So when one partner proposes to use violence, or one partner is found to have the tendency to break the country apart, coalitions are now forming around that. So it looks like there will be in future a reward around coalitions of violent partners. So the more violent you can be, the more you can shake up a country, you're able to come to the table and negotiate to form part of the government. We've seen that in Sudan's. It's a trend to watch. It's a trend to watch where we are negotiating around who is more violent and who needs to be brought on board so that the country does not break. So there's a lot of dynamics that go behind with that. The other thing that we are carrying on from 2017 to the current elections is the information disorder that John has spoken about. So there's a lot of propaganda, but a lot of it is around malinformation, disinformation, and of course seeing external companies, transnational companies coming on board and distorting the space. So whoever is going to vote, their hand is not independent. Their hand is being manipulated by some forces that are using media, social media and social media platforms. What else are we witnessing? We are seeing weaponization of of government institutions. So if you come from the opposition, you find that some of these government institutions are being used, for example, to chase you after corruption, to chase you for other crimes. So that element of tracking corruption has now been weaponized. So it stops being a fair ground where citizens can go and look at the ethics and anti-corruption, challenge who the leaders are coming, where the leaders were coming in, but rather we see the state is using some of those institutions to hit at those who are considered to be opponents. During the curfew period, would notice that the curfews would be announced when there was heated political movement, especially from the opposition. So that again becomes another weaponization of state control. In terms of violent extremism, we continue to realize that counties that are bordering Somalia continue to experience this threat of violence. And what that means is that it has ability to displace communities. It has ability to affect the movement of votes and voting material to those places. And it has got also the ability to cut off communication, because one of the things that the violent extremist networks are doing is that they target the communication masts, they target the roads, they target civil servants, and they target anybody who's aligned to any government position. So they targeted the teachers in the past, and the teachers fled. And the northeastern region of Kenya was left without teachers. So it's another risk to watch, that as we go towards election, as we continue to witness incidences of violent extremism targeting public transport services and civil servants, that we might need to relook at how we manage elections in those places. Finally, I want to talk about apathy, the youth apathy. As much as the youth are in the front line, we noticed that there was a bit of slackness from the young people in terms of registering, because they feel that they don't belong, that already the big positions are being negotiated. Politics belongs to a class of a few people who can afford the politics. So the politics of exclusion, the politics of marginalization, either clan-based, ethnic-based, is something that we carry on to 20 2017 to 2022. Finally, activists have now started getting jailed. The people who went to the road to protest for COVID theft, there was quite a bit of theft of funds from the COVID resources that had been pumped into the country. There's activists who went to the streets to protest. 4 of them were arrested and have now been sentenced to 6 months, luckily out of prison. So they're serving their sentences at home, but that is a very discouraging trend. If we continue to have people getting locked up, it means that that space continues to shrink. That is my submission.
Thank you so much, Judy, for this very inciting contribution. And thank you, everyone, for all the unique perspectives that you shared from your context. Most of which have spoken to election management, violent elections, violation of human rights, as well as how youth are involved in all of this. There are a lot of interesting questions that have been coming in, and I would like us to address them. So the first question is, what is the role of civil society and the private sector to support democracy strengthening in each of your contexts? We'll take 3 questions. The second is, to what extent can international actors and donors adapt their procedures and regulations to best adapt to the context of restrictions on freedom of organization and to the conditions of humanitarian agencies? An example is the responses to humanitarian crises in Ukraine and the restrictive measures to civil society in Tunisia. And I think this question is best directed to Roman and Maurice. And then the third question is, in places like Lebanon, Syria, Sudan, and Tunisia, political groups have struggled to unify their approaches in the opposition to government in power. In your perspective, why does this happen? So I think we're going to first of all hand over to you, Johnny, to give your response. Then we'd move to Maurice, Roman, and Judy.
Sure, I'm happy to. Do you prefer which question I take on, or
the second question?
The second question. So I think that even when we're not doing a good job, it is definitely the case that we are always modifying our approaches to attempt to respond to the unique circumstances of the moment. I think that to take the crises cited, something like Ukraine, first and foremost, has required just an enormous increase in what we do. And that's across a wide range of fronts. Within USAID, we try and keep 2 separate, mostly separate sides of the house. There's humanitarian aid, which is like fiercely neutral and impartial and goes to the area of the greatest need, even when that's a complicated political thing. And then there's all of the development assistance, democracy assistance that we also do. And in a case like Ukraine, that happens at the same time as our Defense Department is engaged in like a very extensive military partnership with actors on the ground. So that's a continual juggling act, but it's about responding to the needs of the moment. And in this case, I think it's relatively straightforward in the sense of like the need is almost boundless. And generally speaking, we are, since I don't have to deal with the military questions, there's almost nothing that is off the table. And so we are just trying to anticipate every contingency in a very unpredictable war. And I should say, be ready for a very long war, even though I sorely hope that's not what's coming, but be ready for something that could take a very long time. And in a case like Tunisia, that's a case where we have to be agile. I mean, we have radically increased already our assistance to Tunisia because it was a democratic success story, despite all of the qualifications to that, the problems with Tunisian democracy that Moise eloquently enumerated. Long before Kais Saied was elected, it was very clear that was an imperfect democracy, but like we had good incentive, and I think it was the right choice to radically increase assistance. Now we have this problem that like, even the flawed democracy that Tunisia had has been unraveled at devastating speed. And one thing I think unites many of the countries we've seen is it's very common for, at a moment of apathy, like Judy described, or disillusionment, like we've all experienced, populations can accept something like what Kais Saied is doing for a while. And you could see like his popularity stayed very high, even as he dismantled the judiciary and now the legislature. That does not remain the case almost anywhere. And the problem is that by the time populations have turned against these, like, I think, incredibly short-sighted moves by a burgeoning authoritarian, it's too late, and they lack a lot of the tools. So we, USAID, we, the donor community, have to think very hard about what things that we have piled into a place like Tunisia over the years are helpful to democracy and what things have become harmful in light of new realities. And so we're working through that question. It's thorny, like you don't want to just withdraw everything in a fit of pique and suddenly find that the tools are more limited than ever. I'm going to wrap up my answer because my sick 2-year-old is about to join us for this call, but I'd love to hear from others anyway.
Roman, would you like to respond, please?
Thank you, Fatima, and hello, new participant there. I would probably touch on the things that Johnny has already been speaking about, and in terms of international cooperation and in terms of the work of international organizations and how it can work and what can be done. I have already touched a little bit on the good examples while mentioning the support of international organizations like USAID in Ukraine, like EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and a lot of others. Fortunately, I've been a part of the software development company that was developing the procurement system for the government of Ukraine, so I know a lot about the involvement of international organizations into those processes. In my opinion, there should be more organizations like that, more governments that support each other and work towards the common goal, and more cooperation and less separation. And I think we kind of been touching on that multiple times today already. I think there should be less of you and me and should be more of us. You know, everyone after the Second World War said never again, you know, but a lot of people knew that the war, like the one that we are having in Ukraine, will come again. And it did because, you know, we started to let things slip through, like let the little problems become the big problems and let the evil slowly poison us. But I think that now, you know, that this war broke out, the picture is pretty clear. Everyone understands what they need to do. It is clear that international organizations like United Nations are not able to put up with the challenges of today. It is clear that we need to work together to change that quickly. Otherwise, more democracies will have to pay the price. I think that that is inevitable. But at the same time, we see that the global community is mobilizing. The price Ukraine is paying today is extremely high. One incident alone, like 2 days, I'm not sure if you heard about it, but there was a bombardment with a 500-kilo bomb on a train station of Kramatorsk, which already claimed lives over 40 people, including 2 children. That is horrifying. And, you know, I have no doubt that we will win, we will rebuild and become once again a great example of that democracy that, you know, for everyone. And of course, as we always did, we as a country will support our partners on the road to the democracy and to the freedom as well. And to all of you, you know, here, to participants and to the panelists and to everybody who is listening, I just want to say that now is a great time to get into the work of supporting democracies like Ukraine, for creating those opportunities and for supporting our businesses, for stepping in. I think we are witnessing the changes that will give birth to the new world. And Johnny has already mentioned that. It will be full of strong, young, smart, and good people that will be able to put up with the challenges of today. So if you want to be part of it, I think you should jump on board today. Whichever organization you are representing here today, I think you should jump on board. I think you should look into this because, you know, of course, looking into the state of what's going on in Ukraine, we see that it's in the center of attention, but there are lots of other places around the world that need our support. We need to put up the fight here. We need to win. We need to show by a good example of how things can be done. And we need to spread that around the world and let others live in a democratic, free, and healthy society where there is a value to human life. So that's it on my end. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Roman. Judy, very quickly, what are your reflections on any of the questions that have been asked?
So I would want to pick it up and highlight some of the important places that we need to focus our attention on. The role of youth, growing leadership. And growing leadership means that the corporate sector, the private sector begins to open up spaces for youth to take board leadership, because once they start corporate leadership, it ushers them to more governance spaces, open up opportunities for young people to do their startup, their tech companies, their initiatives, their community actions, grow leadership in that manner, so that by the time we are getting to points of transition, they have already developed an idea. And what I'll present here is that we consider the Youth, Peace and Security 2250 that talks about protecting the youth, putting political actors to account for mobilizing youth into violence. Rather, we should start rewarding political formations that are protecting youth, that are enabling youth to participate, and that we ourselves are creating pots of funding that are accessible to young people. Sometimes the technical proposals that we develop might not be something that the youth can crack very easily. So organizations like ours, once we receive the pot of funding, that we keep a chunk of funding and make it available to the youth. The same case, also make it available to the women, because there's the issue of empathy, there's the issue of negotiation, there's the issue of inclusion. So for me, in terms of private sector engagement, put money into those spaces where ideas, where initiatives can grow. I learned from Wangari Maathai, when she was mobilizing for multipartyism, she started working with women to grow trees. But the idea of growing trees was not the end in itself. It was a way of bringing women every 2 days a week to water the trees, but then to talk about what are they seeing in their spaces, what should be the movement. And by the time she had been noticed by the government, she had got hundreds of women groups talking about leadership and governance. So let's put resources down to where the women are meeting, where the youth are meeting, and strengthen those spaces and grow them as we transition towards elections and moving forward.
Thank you so much, Judy. Over to you, Maurice. You're muted, Maurice.
Yes, sorry, thank you very much. And thank you, Johnny, for your deep analysis of the Tunisian context. And I think you said it very well. Unfortunately, as you said, still, Qais Saidi have a big trust of the Tunisians. However, are they supporting him for his vision, or are they supporting him because he's helping them taking revenge over the Islamists? This is the point. And I think, and I thank also USAID for the great work that they're doing in Tunisia, because they focused on three main pillars: governance, civic education, and civics and citizenship awareness, and rebuilding community resilience, society resilience. These are the three things that we need to focus and develop more, as well as working and supporting and reinforce or reinstate the position of the institution, and so they can play their role properly into the society, because we cannot build democracy without strong institutions, constitutional institutions, effective constitutional institution, and also a civil society that have been playing its role for the last 11 years in preventing violent extremism, in preventing the departure of young Tunisians to join the zone of conflict, in minimizing the impact of the populist and the political party opportunism approaches, and minimize the way they were playing to gain the votes. Because unfortunately, they took the opportunity where we initiated a process of transforming the Tunisians from a state to from just subjects to being citizen. After over 60 years of authoritarian regime, I think Tunisians that got used, or their comfort zone is to be subject and having someone to decide for them. Now it's a process where we have to work on citizens so they take their own decisions and do responsible votes in order to have the leaders that we need. Democracy is in danger, and also the private sector, they need to invest in democracy and invest in the resources, in young qualified persons we have in Tunisia, so we can create the first story of success in order to protect our society. We have tens of thousands of Tunisian qualified persons leaving the country to Europe, to the United States, to North America, everywhere, because Tunisia is not complying with their expectation, and we cannot dream anymore in this country. This is what we need. We need to bring life, and we bring back life and democracy and rebuild the cohesion and have a real strong society.
Thank you so much, Maurice, for your response. By way of closing remarks, Johnny Walsh, where do we go from here? What should we take away from this discussion?
I feel like I'm the least worthy to give summation remarks of everything that we've heard here today. But I think that for all of us engaged in supporting democracy and human rights as a deeply interrelated concept, we just have to recognize this is a more important struggle than it's ever been. And we have to prioritize it above a great many of the other important things out there in the world that compete for our attention. And so, you know, if I turn my lens on the US government, on other wealthy and powerful governments, you know, there are many times where we have maybe not made the best decisions in the past in balancing democracy and human rights considerations against all the other things we're trying to do in the world. I'm not sure we have that luxury anymore. And I think that, like I said before, that was already true well before the Russian attack on Ukraine, but it has focused the mind. And a moment like this, where there's such widespread belief that advancing democracy for its own sake is like such a central good, that's not going to be true all of our lifetimes. It wasn't true 3 years ago. It might not be true 3 years from now. So we have to like really seize this moment and like identify the places where progress is possible. I think that progress is possible in all three of the countries that our panelists have featured today. You know, it's heroes on the ground doing the real work, but they need support from the outside. And we have to recognize that these aren't just questions of values for, you know, governments in the West or wherever. Values and interests are inextricably intertwined. It's more like short-term interests versus only slightly less short-term interests. So I hope that the events of the last year have been as galvanizing as I perceive them to be, and that we all come out of this really motivated to help the Ukraines, the Kenyas, Tunisias to entrench democracy and all the benefits that flow from it.
Thank you so much, everyone, for an extremely insightful discussion, and a huge shout out to you, Roman, especially for joining us from Ukraine with the difficult situation on ground. And thank you also to the audience for your participation. We sincerely apologize that we couldn't go through all the questions, but this demonstrates that there is a lot to share from all the contexts that are here on the panel. And there is a lot also that can be done by to enhance international multi-stakeholder collaboration to safeguard democratic institutions and ensure peaceful development of democracies. I would like to invite us all to keep this conversation going in the work that we do and in our different contexts. Thank you so much for your contributions, and thank you for making it to the event. Bye.